Sarah Martinez had been flying rescue missions in war-torn regions for over 8 years. The experienced helicopter pilot thought she had seen everything until that foggy morning in the mountains of Eastern Europe. Her humanitarian organization had received urgent reports of civilians trapped in a remote village, cut off by recent fighting between government forces and rebel groups. As she approached the coordinates in her medical evacuation helicopter, something felt wrong. The village looked too quiet, too organized. There were no signs of the desperate civilians she was supposed to rescue. Instead, she noticed armed men positioned strategically around the landing zone, their weapons glinting in the pale sunlight that filtered through the morning mist. Sarah's military training from her days as an army pilot kicked in immediately. She recognized an ambush when she saw one. These weren't government soldiers or typical rebels. Their equipment was too sophisticated, their positioning too professional. This was a well-planned trap, and she had flown right into it. The radio crackled with a voice speaking accented English. "Medical helicopter, you will land immediately in the marked zone. Do not attempt to leave or we will shoot you down." Sarah's heart pounded as she realized she had two impossible choices: land and become a prisoner, or try to escape and risk being shot out of the sky with a rocket launcher she could now see pointed directly at her aircraft. She made a calculated decision. Better to land and look for an opportunity to escape later than to die in a fiery crash. As her helicopter touched down in the designated area, armed men in military fatigues rushed toward her from all directions. They moved with the precision of trained soldiers surrounding her aircraft before she could even shut down the engines. The leader of the group, a tall man with cold gray eyes and a thick beard, yanked open her cockpit door. "Get out slowly," he commanded in broken English. "You are now our prisoner. Your helicopter will serve our cause." Sarah raised her hands and climbed out, her mind already working on escape plans. She had survived worse situations than this, but she had never been captured while piloting a multi-million-dollar aircraft that could be used for military purposes. As they roughly searched her for weapons and communication devices, Sarah noticed something crucial. The guards were focused entirely on securing her as a prisoner, but they were treating her helicopter like a prize they had just won. None of them seemed to be experienced pilots. They kept looking at the aircraft with a mixture of greed and uncertainty, clearly planning to use it but unsure of how to operate the complex machinery. That night, as they locked her in a small concrete building that served as a makeshift prison, Sarah could hear them arguing outside. Their leader was growing frustrated because none of his men knew how to fly the helicopter properly. They had captured the aircraft they wanted, but without her cooperation, it was just an expensive piece of metal sitting uselessly in their compound. Sarah smiled grimly in the darkness. She had found their weakness. They needed her alive and cooperative to make their plan work. And that gave her exactly the advantage she needed to turn the tables on her captors. The question was whether she could execute her own plan before they figured out a way to force her compliance, or found someone else who could pilot their stolen aircraft. The sound of guards changing shifts outside her prison told her that morning was approaching. Soon they would come for her again, expecting her to teach them how to use her helicopter for their military operations. But Sarah Martinez had other plans entirely. She had spent the sleepless night working out every detail of what would either be a brilliant escape or a fatal mistake. Her captors thought they had won by taking her prisoner along with her aircraft. They had no idea that they had just given an experienced combat pilot exactly what she needed to orchestrate the most daring escape of her career. The helicopter they saw as their prize was about to become her ticket to freedom. When the guards came for Sarah the next morning, she was ready with her performance. She had decided to play the role of a frightened cooperative prisoner who would do anything to stay alive. It went against every instinct she had developed during her military service, but she knew that appearing weak and compliant was her best strategy for getting close to her helicopter again. The bearded leader, who she learned was called Commander Kozlov, brought her to the aircraft with 2 armed guards flanking her on each side. "You will teach my men to fly this machine," he announced, gesturing toward the helicopter with obvious pride. "If you cooperate, you will be treated well. If you refuse, you will regret it." Sarah nodded nervously. playing her part perfectly. "I'll help you," she said in a trembling voice that was completely manufactured. "Just please don't hurt me. I have a family back home." The lie came easily, and she could see that Kozlov believed her act completely. He probably thought all civilian pilots were soft and easily intimidated. Over the next several hours, Sarah began what appeared to be flight training for 3 of Kozlov's men. She explained the basic controls, showed them how to start the engines, and walked them through the instrument panel. But she was careful to leave out crucial details and occasionally provide slightly incorrect information that would prevent them from actually flying the aircraft successfully. When they tried to practice hovering, she would give them just enough guidance to lift off a few feet before subtly directing them to make mistakes that forced them to land again quickly. Each time she would apologize and claim that helicopter flying was much more difficult than it looked, requiring years of training to master properly. Kozlov grew increasingly impatient as the day wore on. His men were struggling with even the most basic maneuvers, and he could see that his prize aircraft was not going to be immediately useful to his operations. Sarah could sense his frustration building, and knew she needed to provide just enough progress to keep him from giving up entirely or looking for alternative solutions. During a break in the training, she overheard 2 guards discussing their plans for her helicopter. They intended to use it for supply runs to remote locations and for reconnaissance flights over government positions. Some of their conversation was in a language she didn't understand, but she caught enough English and familiar military terms to piece together their strategy. That evening, as they returned her to the makeshift prison, Sarah noticed something important. The compound's security was focused outward, designed to prevent attacks from external forces. There were fewer guards watching the interior areas, and the sentries were primarily concerned with perimeter defense. More importantly, her helicopter was parked only about 50 meters from her prison building, and there was a clear path between the 2 locations. As night fell, Sarah began preparing for the most critical phase of her plan. She had spent the day convincing her captors that she was a helpless prisoner who could be useful to them. Tomorrow, she would need to convince them that she was ready to fully cooperate with their plans, which would require them to trust her enough to let her demonstrate a solo flight. She had also been carefully observing the daily routines of the guards. They changed shifts at dawn and dusk, and there was always a brief period during the transition when their attention was divided. The morning shift change would be her best opportunity, but everything would depend on perfect timing and her ability to start the helicopter and take off before the guards could react. Sarah knew that her military training had prepared her for situations exactly like this one. She had learned to think several steps ahead of her enemies and to use their assumptions against them. Kozlov and his men believed they had captured a frightened civilian pilot who would do whatever they demanded to survive. They had no idea they were dealing with someone who had completed advanced combat flight training and had experience in hostile environments. The sound of guards talking outside her prison reminded her that she was running out of time. Soon, Kozlov might decide that training his men was taking too long and look for other options. He might bring in a different pilot, or worse, he might decide that she was more valuable as a hostage than as a flight instructor. Sarah settled down to get what rest she could before dawn. Tomorrow would determine whether her deception had been clever enough to give her the opportunity she needed, or whether she had simply delayed the inevitable. Either way, she was done being a prisoner. When the sun rose, she would either be flying to freedom or fighting for her life. Sarah's opportunity came sooner than expected. On the 3rd day of her captivity, Commander Kozlov's patience finally ran out completely. His men had made little progress learning to pilot the helicopter, and Sarah could see the dangerous frustration building in his eyes during their morning training session. "This is taking too long," Kozlov announced, pacing around the aircraft like an angry predator. "My men are too stupid to learn quickly, and we need this machine operational immediately. You will fly it yourself on our missions, starting today." Sarah felt her heart race, but she maintained her frightened prisoner act. "I'll do whatever you want," she said, making her voice shake with apparent fear. "But I need to test the aircraft first. It's been sitting for several days, and helicopters require pre-flight checks to ensure they're safe to operate." Kozlov studied her suspiciously for a moment, but her explanation made sense even to someone without aviation knowledge. "Fine," he agreed. "But you will have 2 of my men with you at all times. Do not think about trying anything foolish." This was exactly what Sarah had been hoping for. She nodded eagerly, playing up her role as an obedient captive. "Of course, Commander. I just want to make sure the helicopter is working properly so I can serve your organization safely. The last thing any of us wants is a mechanical failure during an important mission." As they walked toward the helicopter, Sarah's mind was racing through the final details of her escape plan. She had spent the previous night working out every possible scenario and contingency. The key would be creating a situation where she could get airborne with her captors still inside the aircraft, then using her superior piloting skills to either escape with them as prisoners or force them out at a safe location. Kozlov assigned 2 of his most trusted men to accompany her on the test flight. Both were armed with automatic weapons, and they had clear instructions to shoot her immediately if she attempted anything suspicious. Sarah nodded respectfully at both guards, maintaining her submissive demeanor while mentally cataloging their positions and equipment. As she began her pre-flight inspection, Sarah deliberately took extra time checking systems that were obviously functioning correctly. She wanted to establish a pattern of thorough, slow procedures that would make her captors less suspicious when she needed extra time for the critical moments of her plan. "The hydraulic systems need careful testing," she explained to the guards, pointing at various components that meant nothing to them. "If these failed during flight, we would crash immediately. Commander Kozlov would not be happy if his valuable helicopter was destroyed because we rushed the safety checks." One of the guards, a nervous young man who clearly didn't want to be responsible for damaging their prize aircraft, nodded agreement. The other guard, an older soldier with suspicious eyes, watched her every movement but seemed satisfied that she was genuinely focused on aircraft maintenance rather than escape planning. Sarah completed her inspection and climbed into the pilot's seat, with the 2 guards taking positions behind her where they could watch her every move while keeping their weapons ready. She began the engine startup sequence, explaining each step to her captors as if she were still trying to teach them to fly. "First, we check all the warning lights," she said, pointing to the instrument panel. "Then we start the auxiliary power unit, followed by the main engines. Everything must be done in exactly the right order, or the helicopter could be damaged." As the engines spooled up to operating speed, Sarah felt the familiar vibration of a helicopter coming to life. For the first time in 3 days, she was back in her element, surrounded by the controls and systems she knew better than anything else in the world. The feeling of power and capability that came with being at the controls of an aircraft gave her confidence that her plan would work. "Now we test the flight controls," she announced, moving the cyclic and collective controls through their full range of motion. The guards watched the control surfaces move outside the aircraft, completely unaware that Sarah was also testing their responses and preparing for the violent maneuvers she would need to execute in just a few moments. "Everything looks good," she reported to the suspicious guard. "Are you ready for takeoff? I'll just lift us a few feet off the ground to test the hovering controls, then we can return to the landing zone." The guards nodded their approval, and Sarah began to lift the helicopter into a low hover. This was the moment she had been preparing for. Once they were airborne, even just a few feet off the ground, she would have all the advantages. Her captors had no idea they were about to discover why experienced combat pilots were never truly helpless, even when they appeared to be completely at their enemy's mercy. Sarah took a deep breath and prepared to show Commander Kozlov and his men exactly what happened when they tried to turn a warrior into a prisoner. The moment the helicopter lifted off the ground, Sarah's demeanor changed completely. The frightened prisoner act vanished as she pushed the aircraft into a sudden, violent climbing turn that caught both guards completely off guard. Years of combat flight training took over as she executed a maneuver that would have been impossible for the amateur pilots Kozlov's men had been trying to become. "What are you doing?" shouted the older guard, struggling to maintain his balance as the helicopter banked sharply to the left while climbing rapidly. He tried to bring his weapon to bear on Sarah, but the G-forces and unexpected motion made it impossible for him to aim accurately. Sarah didn't bother to answer. Instead, she pushed the helicopter into an even more aggressive maneuver, using Her knowledge of the aircraft's capabilities to create conditions that would incapacitate her captors without crashing. The younger guard was already looking green and struggling not to vomit, while the older one was desperately trying to brace himself against the aircraft's violent movements. Below them, she could see Commander Kozlov and his remaining men running toward vehicles, clearly planning to pursue her or radio ahead to other units. But Sarah had anticipated this problem and had already planned her route to avoid areas where ground forces could intercept her. "Stop this immediately or I will shoot you," the older guard managed to yell over the noise of the engines and rotor blades. Sarah glanced back at him and saw that he was indeed trying to point his weapon at her, despite the helicopter's erratic motion. This was the moment Sarah had been dreading, but she was ready for it. She executed a maneuver called a split S, rolling the helicopter inverted and then pulling it into a steep dive. The sudden negative G-forces threw both guards toward the ceiling of the aircraft, and she heard the older guard's weapon clatter away as he lost his grip on it. "You're going to kill us all," screamed the younger guard, who was now definitely going to be sick regardless of how the flight ended. Sarah had to admire his dedication to his cause, even though he was clearly terrified. "Not if you listen carefully," Sarah called back to them, her voice calm and professional despite the dangerous flying she was doing. "I'm going to land this helicopter in exactly 3 minutes. When I do, you're going to get out and walk away. If you try to stop me or signal your friends, I'll take off again, and this time, I won't be so careful about keeping you alive." The older guard tried to argue, but another sudden maneuver convinced him that Sarah was completely serious about her threat. She had demonstrated that she could control the aircraft in ways that would be fatal to everyone aboard if she chose to, push the limits even further. Sarah leveled the helicopter and began flying toward a clearing she had identified during her pre-flight planning. It was far enough from Kozlov's compound that his men couldn't reach it quickly, but close enough that her former captors could walk back to their base without serious difficulty. "You cannot escape," the older guard said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Commander Kozlov has radio contact with units throughout this region. They will find you and shoot you down." "Maybe," Sarah acknowledged, beginning her approach to the clearing. "But that's not your problem anymore. Your problem is explaining to your commander how 2 armed men managed to lose control of a single unarmed prisoner." As the helicopter touched down in the clearing, Sarah kept the engines running and turned to face her passengers. "This is where you get out," she announced. "Leave your weapons in the aircraft and start walking. If I see either of you reach for a radio or try to signal anyone, I'll assume you're calling in an attack and respond accordingly." The 2 guards looked at each other uncertainly. They clearly didn't want to abandon their mission or face Kozlov's anger, but they also had no desire to continue flying with a pilot who had demonstrated complete willingness to risk all their lives to achieve her goals. "Move!" Sarah shouted, adding authority to her voice that reminded both men that she had military training and was accustomed to being obeyed. The combination of her demonstrated flying skills and commanding presence convinced them that arguing would be futile and potentially fatal. The younger guard scrambled out of the helicopter immediately, followed more reluctantly by his older companion. Both men left their weapons behind as instructed and began walking back toward their base, occasionally looking over their shoulders but making no attempt to interfere with Sarah's escape. Sarah watched them go for a moment, then turned her attention to the helicopter's navigation and communication systems. She needed to contact her organization and friendly forces to let them know her status. But first she had to get far enough away from hostile territory to make communications safe. As she lifted off from the clearing and turned toward friendly territory, Sarah allowed herself a small smile of satisfaction. Her captors had thought they were clever, trapping a helpless civilian pilot and stealing her aircraft for their own purposes. Instead, they had given an experienced combat aviator exactly what she needed to turn the tables on them completely. Sarah's moment of satisfaction was cut short by the distinctive sound of rotor blades behind her. She checked her mirrors and saw 2 military helicopters approaching rapidly from the direction of Kozlov's compound. Apparently, the commander had managed to acquire aircraft of his own, much faster than she had expected. The pursuing helicopters were older Soviet-era machines, but they appeared to be armed and were definitely faster than her medical evacuation aircraft. Sarah realized that her escape was far from over. Now it would become a test of flying skills against superior numbers and firepower. Her radio crackled with an accented voice she recognized as Kozlov's. "Medical helicopter, you have something that belongs to me. Land immediately and return my men or we will shoot you down." Sarah keyed her microphone, abandoning any pretense of fear or cooperation. "Commander, your men are safe on the ground behind me. This aircraft belongs to a humanitarian organization, and I'm returning it to friendly territory. I suggest you break off your pursuit before the situation escalates beyond your control." Kozlov's response was immediate and predictable. "You are a thief and a terrorist. We will recover our property and punish you for your crimes." Sarah saw the lead helicopter's weapon systems beginning to track her aircraft and knew that negotiations were over. She pushed her helicopter into a steep dive toward the treetops, using the terrain to break the visual contact of her pursuers. Her aircraft might be slower and less maneuverable than theirs, but she had advantages they didn't know about. Her medical helicopter was equipped with sophisticated navigation systems and defensive countermeasures that most civilian aircraft didn't carry. The forest canopy provided temporary concealment, but Sarah knew she couldn't hide for long. Pursuing aircraft would spread out and use coordinated search patterns to flush her out of cover. She needed a strategy that would either disable her pursuers or get her to safety before they could bring their superior firepower to bear. Racing. Through a narrow valley at treetop level, Sarah spotted what she had been looking for: a region of steep hills and narrow canyons that would limit her pursuer's ability to maneuver, while giving her opportunities to use her superior knowledge of helicopter handling in confined spaces. First pursuing helicopter appeared at the mouth of the canyon behind her, and Sarah immediately pulled her aircraft into a tight spiral climb that took her up the canyon wall. The maneuver was dangerous even for an experienced pilot, but it had the desired effect of forcing her pursuer to either break off the attack or risk crashing into the rocky walls. Kozlov's pilot chose to break off, but the second helicopter was already positioning itself at the other end of the canyon to cut off Sarah's escape route. She found herself trapped between two hostile aircraft in a narrow space where her maneuverability advantages were negated. "This is your final warning," Kozlov's voice came over the radio. "Surrender now, or we will open fire." Sarah could see that both helicopters had weapons trained on her aircraft and knew that her options were rapidly running out. That was when she remembered something from her military training about using an aircraft's own systems as defensive tools. Her medical helicopter was equipped with a winch system designed for rescue operations, but it could also be used in ways the manufacturers had never intended. Sarah activated the winch and began lowering the rescue cable as she maneuvered toward the lead pursuer. The steel cable, nearly 200 feet long, became a weapon that could tangle rotor blades or damage control surfaces if used correctly. The pursuing pilot saw the cable deploy and realized immediately what Sarah was attempting. He tried to climb above the cable's reach, but Sarah matched his ascent while swinging the heavy steel line toward his aircraft's vulnerable tail rotor. The cable struck the pursuer's tail boom with a metallic crash that was audible even over the noise of both helicopters' engines. Sarah saw the other aircraft begin to spin as its tail rotor was damaged, forcing the pilot to auto-rotate to an emergency landing in the canyon below. That left one pursuer, but now Sarah had demonstrated that she was willing and able to use unconventional tactics to defend herself. The remaining helicopter backed off to a safer distance while its pilot undoubtedly radioed for additional support. Sarah didn't wait to see what reinforcements might be coming. She retracted the winch cable and pushed her helicopter toward the canyon exit, using every bit of speed and maneuverability her aircraft possessed to reach friendly territory before more enemies could arrive. The radio traffic behind her was growing more urgent and coordinated, indicating that Kozlov was calling in favors from Allied units throughout the region. Sarah realized that her escape had become a race against time, with the finish line being the international border that was still more than 50 miles away. The international border appeared ahead of Sarah like a lifeline stretching across the mountainous terrain. She could see the distinctive markings that indicated friendly territory, but she could also see 3 more helicopters converging on her position from different directions. Kozlov had managed to coordinate a significant response to her escape attempt. Sarah's fuel gauge was showing dangerously low levels after the high-speed chase and combat maneuvering. She had enough fuel to reach the border, but not much beyond that point. If friendly forces didn't respond quickly to her arrival, she might end up stranded in a contested border region where Kozlov's allies could still reach her. The radio filled with multiple voices as the pursuing aircraft coordinated their final attack. They planned to force her down just short of the international boundary, where they could claim she had crashed in disputed territory and recover both the helicopter and its pilot without creating diplomatic complications. Sarah activated her emergency transponder and began broadcasting on international emergency frequencies, identifying herself as a humanitarian pilot under attack by hostile forces. She provided her exact coordinates and requested immediate assistance from any friendly military units in the area. The response was almost immediate. A calm, professional voice with an American accent came over the radio, identifying itself as the flight leader of a patrol that had been monitoring the border region. "Medical helicopter, this is Eagle Flight. We have you on radar and are moving to intercept. Maintain your current heading and altitude." Sarah felt a surge of relief, but she knew she wasn't safe yet. The pursuing helicopters were closing in rapidly, and she could see that at least 2 of them were armed with air-to-air missiles. They might be willing to risk an international incident if they could eliminate her before friendly forces arrived. The lead pursuer began to accelerate toward her, clearly intending to force her aircraft down through ramming if necessary. Sarah prepared for another defensive maneuver, but suddenly the radio filled with a new voice speaking in heavily accented English. "Unknown aircraft pursuing medical helicopter. This is Eagle Flight Leader. You are approaching international airspace. Without authorization, break off your pursuit immediately, or you will be engaged as hostile targets." Sarah looked up and saw 4 military jets approaching from the direction of the border. They were flying in attack formation and had obviously been scrambled to respond to her emergency call. The sight of professional military aircraft coming to her aid was the most beautiful thing she had seen in days. The pursuing helicopters immediately broke off their attack and began retreating toward their own territory. None of Kozlov's pilots were willing to engage modern fighter aircraft in air-to-air combat, regardless of how valuable their prize might be. Sarah crossed into international airspace with the fighter escort maintaining protective positions around her aircraft. The relief she felt was overwhelming, but she forced herself to concentrate on flying until she was safely on the ground at a friendly military base. As she approached the landing zone, Sarah could see medical teams and intelligence officers waiting to debrief her. There would be questions about her capture and escape, reports to file, and probably diplomatic protests to handle. But all of that was for later. Right now she was free, her aircraft was intact, and she had proven that experience and determination could overcome superior numbers when combined with creative thinking and skilled flying. Commander Kozlov and his men had learned the hard way that capturing a warrior was not the same thing as defeating one. As Sarah shut down her helicopter's engines and stepped onto friendly soil, she allowed herself to smile. Her captors had thought they were clever, trapping what they believed was a helpless civilian pilot. Instead, they had given her exactly what she needed to orchestrate one of the most daring escapes in aviation history. The helicopter they had tried to steal was back, where it belonged, and the pilot they had tried to break had proven that some people simply refused to stay captured. Sarah Martinez had turned her captor's trap into her own victory, and the story would become legend among pilots who understood that true freedom was something worth fighting for, no matter what the odds. In the end, Kozlov's men had been right about one thing. They had indeed captured something valuable when they took her prisoner. They just hadn't realized that what they had captured was far more dangerous than they could have imagined, and that their prize would ultimately become the instrument of their own defeat.